first time in New York City, I was in a cab that did the 360. It was very romantic. And actually everything else, buses, cars, trucks, they were all doing the same thing at the same time. So it was like slow motion, Walt Disney. Anyway, of course it means that we are what we are here tonight, but a special warm welcome on a cold night to our visitor is an architect from Cape Town, but also from New York in the classic kind of New York way, kind of born somewhere, grew up here, goes back, does good, a lot of good, and I guess that's what I'm super interested in. The McKellar Lab starts in 2004, the studio, and it already, of course, has this word lab in there, so implying that there's a kind of experiment, that it's not simply a studio, but there's some kind of research and some kind of a project. And this project seems to involve testing an idea about public interaction, and that the purpose of architecture is for the kinds of interaction that it makes possible. But I especially am interested in the way in which you think about the interaction is not the interaction that the architect designs for now, but what interaction might take place when the current user and the current architect have gone. And also the fact that this kind of a statement about creating the possibility of future exchange, so like what you call legacy, like kind of the legacy of an architect, so you're kind of designing for legacy, that's done in the context of a culture of fear. So basically everybody's too nervous to get together in public space because you might catch an idea or a disease or whatever. And that leads to your kind of argument that good design is a basic human right, and that design itself goes from being a sort of a virtuous addition or criticism or supplement to what's considered the basic conditions of social exchange. It's actually considered as a kind of crucial requirement of social exchange and so on. And I think you do that in your work, but you also do that almost diplomatically by working at the World Economic Forum on the global agenda for design and all of that. So it's just oozing virtue. I think there was not a more virtuous person ever spoke in this room. And also an elegant person. And I think that there is also something about the way the world is moving now. Other than in the 60s, to be virtuous meant also not to be beautiful. And in the 60s, they tried out the idea that, and this applies to architecture, that an ethically responsible architecture would also be an elegant architecture. And I think the current generation of architects seems to me is super interesting in the refusal of any need to choose between ethical responsibility, elegance, professional success, technical sophistication, and so on. So we really live in a very different mindset, and I think your work is very much coming from that mindset, and it's really very stimulating to us that you and Mario are working together in the design studios, and therefore, as always, it's nice to hear outside of the studio what you're thinking. So very much welcome to the school.
Thank you very much. I'm a bit overwhelmed by the extent of research you've done on me. Clearly the web is a very good device. Okay, let me start by saying the way I've structured the presentations with a short sort of paper which talks to my position on architecture, and then basically a series of projects taken at quite a light cut sort of level. The idea being that it should be a provocation so that questions can emerge from the crowd in terms of the actual solutions. So let me start. Esteemed colleagues, students, and friends, I thank you for this opportunity to share a few ideas, an anthology, as it were, which speaks to the nature of architecture as an act of agency and urgency in the South African context. I hold that architecture is a contingent act mediated by contradictory and promiscuous forces which can conspire to diminish the potential of space and the built environment, and yet equally sets the condition for new and multivariate readings of morphology. If we conceive architecture as more than the receptacle of programmed space, elaborated skin, but as catalytic nodes in a physical and existential terrain, architecture can assume political dimension in which the politics of aesthetics and ethics and place can merge into a seamless intentionality. This syntax forms a code, a language in which the message transcends form, but is a tactical conversation of being, knowing, and not knowing. Such intentionalities cannot be calibrated outside of the specificity of context and the indeterminacy of human relationships, where architecture is a dialogue between place and technology, intellectual capital and mythology, power and vulnerability. This metabolism, this delicate dance of design, seeks to find a syncopated rhythm, an eclectic harmonization between the imagined and the real, between the physical certainty of today and the promise of tomorrow. This mode of praxis foregrounds the situatedness of theory as a tool and adaptive informant of intervention and experimentation. But when located in the fragile and vulnerable terrain of scarcity and addressing developmental state needs, design often requires bold humility and often selfless regard. South Africa is a hyper-terrain of flux in which binary and reified readings readily emerge, but the complexity of the socio-cultural condition is in its resistance to fixed coordinates of meaning and possibilities, where, not dissimilar to Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, definitions of architecture in Africa are viscous, temporal, and tangential. This heterotopic landscape is chimera-like in nature. It's defined to monoculture and visual readings of syntax and space. Architecture under such conditions must confront undiscovered vertices of meaning, myth, function, and morphology, and embrace contradiction if authenticity and truth to space, place, and time can emerge. The morphological implications of this epistemological odyssey represents an undiscovered and perhaps alternate terrain in the global context of architectural discourse. Where architecture engages with homogeneous culture and dominant cultural narratives, I would argue that its contextual purpose is simplified through the various publics that encounter the edifice that have been historically empowered to read the text of the architecture and therefore find resonant and immanent meanings. The enigma that is Africa is in its heterogeneous and contradictory landscapes of excess and poverty, cultural misogyny, an untapped abundance and legacy of intentional fractured development. And this enigma is the foundation for a contested terrain in which the nature of an appropriate architecture defies simplistic Cartesian matrices of meaning and perspective, but rather a mutable landscape of innuendo, double entendre, hybrid spatial strategies which equally affirm and deny the creolization of contemporary African culture. South Africa in particular occupies this queasy tableau where urbanism, architecture, and landscape can conspire to support the emergence of meta-narratives around which society can cohere, and with it the promise of a morphology which transcends form, but reflects and channels the unspoken, submerged vectors of being, and subverts the subservience of the subaltern into dignified cultural actors. My work is the task to translate this complexity into simple, elegant, humanist solutions that are in effective dialogue with their context. I noticed that I put spring over there, and I think that's not in tune with what nature has intended outside. So forgive me on that particular score. I'll just see if this mouse works. I'll start just by giving you an image that maybe people don't necessarily associate with South Africa and Cape Town. Cape Town is a place which has stark, if not startling, beauty. In some parts architectural, but the sort of natural context, it's an amazing place to be in. But at the same time, just outside of the periphery of town, it stands against extreme poverty, degradation, and extreme levels of contrast. And I think what this does, it makes the position of the architect quite contentious because it's very easy to decide which world one wants to operate in. And that's why I make this point about the relationship between the politics and ethics of the architect and the role of the agent. Because I've made a conscious decision to try and splice conditions where a degraded context can benefit from the role of the architect and actually avoid the easy route of doing glamorous and sexy buildings for the well-heeled and the rich. Cape Town is, and I just thought I'd show you this diagram, is a very distorted city. It has a central city core along the side and essentially a periphery that wraps around its edge. And this is a direct product of apartheid planning in which the city core was essentially a space of white privilege with dormitory settlements along the edge. And you will begin to see that this has an implication because depending on where one situates a project or the sort of relationship to the urban planning strategies of the day, one can intervene productively or unproductively. So, I'll take you through projects at different scales. First off, with World Cup, I was actually contacted by Budweiser last year as part of a national competition to design a trophy for the World Cup. And the strategy that I developed was actually quite a simple one. I first decided to critique the sort of history of trophies and, let's say, recognition of success, ranging from the wreath to the amphora to the urn, the chalice, the traditional trophy. And what was quite consistent with all of these is this notion of a cup or something that actually holds liquid or fluidity, a sense of a receptacle. And for me, I said, if we're going to make an African trophy, I think it needs to do two things. I think it needs to respond to, let's say, an African sensibility about how to express success, but more importantly, the issues of the day need to come to the fore. So through a very quick presentation, we're looking at, beadwork and craft work, and also looking at the bottle itself. I decided to recycle the bottles and actually use them as part of the strategy for the trophy. So, in short, you have one bottle, and you empty it, and you've got the glass. More drinking produces numerous empty bottles, and I was fascinated with the glass and the actual cap. So what I did essentially was propose that we would recycle all of the glass, crush them into beads, recycle the caps to form a sort of meshed, let's call it meshed sort of web, and that putting these together, one would deconstruct the notion of the trophy so that on the one hand, you have a sort of firm exoskeleton from the aluminium, but on the inside, this sort of spongy, soft and almost pliant sort of internal skin. And the sort of formal language of this, I decided to steer away from the metaphor of a cup, but said that I would look at sort of sensual forms relating to dance, music, and natural phenomena, and propose this actually for Budweiser. The proportions of the actual trophy were structured according to the number of games. There was an issue about the weight of the current trophy, so these ones could not be heavier than them. And the intention was that there would be 64 of these trophies, and at the end of every World Cup match, the man of the match would be given this trophy. This was supposed to be done through cell phone competition throughout the world. I explained to Budweiser that the logistics of doing a live cell phone competition globally would probably defeat them, and unfortunately it did. With this competition, I was actually told that I had won, but apparently the CEO of Budweiser said it didn't look African enough. And I found that to be quite interesting, that he knew more about an African aesthetic than I did. The winning trophy was actually a drum, very clever, and unfortunately it was never manufactured. But I thought it would be quite an interesting way to just show you how that notion of aesthetics, and also how one can question the fundamentals of what is a trophy and try and articulate something different. And in terms of a jump in scale, a lot of my work, as I think as Marcus mentioned, works beyond the architectural scale. I get involved with institutional structures. I get involved with essentially establishing organizations, because in South Africa we're at the beginnings of our democracy, so the type of conditions which allow for architecture to emerge are often not there. So this particular project essentially I was asked to do some eco-lodges using local materials in a very sensitive forest, but quite importantly, we had to use homeless people to actually build the building and so on. So the notion of having a sort of strong intellectual capital and how you detail the buildings becomes transformed when you realize you're dealing with people who've never even held a piece of wood before. So the exercise here, in part it's responding to context, to wind and so on, but I think the real hypothesis and journey is what type of architectural language is appropriate when the people making buildings are at a almost zero skill level. And this had various implications for the language of the building. The fact that I had to use found materials off-site to actually construct the building, so there wasn't the luxury of me using the sort of typical materials that one would expect. But I think what was very successful about the project, and that stone wall, by the way, we had to demolish it 3 times to teach people how to put a stone wall together, but it seamlessly fits into its context, and there were sensitive trees that had to be avoided. So the design methodology of this project was very much one of sensitivity, one of calm. And I'm quite proud to say that through this project, we trained almost 60 different people, homeless people who now know how to make a door, who now know how to make a window, and they're able to take those skills elsewhere. So the impact of this project is less about its form and more about its mode of becoming. And these are just some other shots. I expect this will be published before the end of the year if everything works out well. Very simple, low-tech sort of solution, but the detailing was quite a rigorous and challenging exercise, and that's an interior shot of the space. All using alien vegetation, by the way, so we tried not to disturb the vegetation that was natural to the landscape. My next project is a police station, and this is a project, my first enclosed building, which won an award. And I'll tell you why it won an award. The police, for various historical reasons, have occupied a very contentious space in South Africa's history. They were often involved as an instrument of the state to repress people. They were not trusted by anybody, and even I, to this day, I still have a shiver down my spine when I see police walking down the street, regardless of their nationality. When the police contacted me about making this police station, they said that we needed a place where we could interact with the public. And my departure point was that I would say that I would make the building not look like a police station. Now, this sounds pretty simple. Up until this point, police stations had slot windows so that you could fire out of them. They had brown brick walls so that you can't actually see the dirt on them. Very defensive strategies, and in fact, all of their buildings were fortresses in the landscape. And I said that, one, this building will actually be fragile. So I'm actually going to make it white so that if dirt shows up, it encourages you to clean it. Second, I'm going to remove all of the burglar bars, which they had on all of the windows, and I would have no fence at the front side. Essentially, I would turn the inside of the station outward and make it a public sort of building. The success of this project is that it has now informed the national strategy for how all police stations should interact with their setting. Not necessarily the form of the building per se, but really that police stations can become part of their context and can afford to be ephemeral and in that way show strength, as opposed to showing strength by having a fortress-like sort of architecture. The staff in this building have loved the building. I go there and visit it often. But the most intriguing thing one of the most intriguing things was when I was dealing with the police superintendent and I was putting in hand-screw taps and so on in the bathrooms. The police superintendent said, "Don't give the police nice things. They will destroy them. They're all animals." And I said, if you treat your own staff like animals, then they will behave like that. And not only that, they will go out into the world and take it out on ordinary people. So I said, let's make a building which brings dignity to the police, because they are a part of our society and they need to see themselves in a different light. And this building it's a fairly ordinary sort of architectural language, but I think it's quite a departure from the normative way of how buildings were designed. In fact, people have said to me, it looks like an art gallery, it looks like anything else. And I said, well, I'm pleased that the one thing it doesn't look like is the stereotypical image of what a police station needs to be. The little curved end over there was a smoker's corner and a barbecue facility, a sort of place where the police would get to rest. And at the time, there seemed to be no necessity for this, but it's one of the most successful and simple spaces in the whole project. And when last I checked, police persons, that is, have been arguing quite a bit to try and be relocated in that particular station. Greenpoint Stadium is a project which I submitted as part of a competition. I was shortlisted. And what was interesting for me about the stadium, and this was for the World Cup, was its potential in terms of what it could offer society, the local society, that is. And what I did is pretty much a hybrid concept. So there was a relationship between the notion of tree providing shelter, again, craft in terms of beadwork, but the location in terms of a mountain, sky, sea relationship, and the protea, which is our national flower. And essentially the design that I developed, I worked on this with HOK Architects in London, was the notion of a very sort of, again, delicate type of structure. But what was, I think for me, that the main purpose of this form is that you'll see the basket at the base. Where the stadium was proposed, there were actually about 5,000 informal traders who used to trade on that site every Sunday, so it was a means of livelihood for them. So my urban strategy was to make a stadium around which the informal sector could still find a place. In other words, this opportunity to create infrastructure for 2010 did not mean that we had to displace local people, and disrupt the local economy. And I was actually quite proud of the design for that sort of, let's call it social purpose, but also the language of a stadium which doesn't look like a typical stadium. Unfortunately, I didn't win it because I was told the design was too radical. I'm sure you might have seen the current stadium, but I'm sorry to say that the 5,000 people who used to trade there no longer trade in that area, and their lives have been disrupted. So again, this relationship between, what a building can do for its context and its sort of ethical responsibility in terms of understanding its space economy, I think is lost on a lot of people, and I think it's a real pity in a place like South Africa where poverty is almost endemic. So it's quite important to imagine how can architecture help stave off these sort of challenges. I've also intervened in other contexts. This is a community center. Mario actually saw this building. Quite a challenging context. I was asked to make a community center in Khayelitsha, and the first problem that we had was that for years and years, the government of the day would spend the least amount of money on community centers, just enough to get votes and to keep the community quiet. So this project started out with a 2 million rand budget, and I made a very strong and impassioned argument about the role of buildings playing a role of legacy and informing the context, and they increased the budget to about 21 million, which, and it's not that I was chasing fees, but it was really about putting enough investment in a building which was really meant to transform and support its context. And the strategy is also quite simple. It's essentially a decorated shed, a sort of box, but the whole front facade actually opens out onto the street, so that the relationship between building and street and public space has far much more potential than a closed off sort of building. The language of the building is uncompromisingly contemporary. There have been a number of interventions in the so-called township context which have been very cynical and very divisive and making arguments for cheap buildings. And I think it's quite important that when one intervenes in fragile contexts, that architecture should not replicate that fragility, but in fact that architecture should be a refuge from the uncertainty of one's context. These are some of the interior shots of the space. For example, the gabion wall along that side uses a particular stone which comes from Table Mountain, and Table Mountain is quite a beautiful natural feature in our landscape. But why I use Table Mountain stone is that in that area, people often look at the mountain, but they don't have a chance to access it. So it takes on a sort of mythological dimension. So I actually had this idea of bringing the mountain back to the people. It's perhaps a strange sort of idea, but the poetry of buildings can mean a lot to people at times. And that's a shot of it shown at the front with the openings. You will notice there are no roads accessing the building. This is one of my key frustrations about development in South Africa, is that it's often very fragmented. The city of Cape Town could not agree to put in a road, so I made a building that was literally standing in a field of dust. And these are the type of issues when I talk about institutional growth and development that's required because you have government working in silos and not talking to each other. But this building also has received a lot of support and respect from the community. It's never been broken into. It doesn't have any burglar bars again. And interesting enough, I was showed a whole range of buildings and told the community will destroy the building, you need to protect it. And this one has managed to protect itself because it's loved by the people. And I'm actually quite proud of that. The Ordos project, I was selected to be involved in it, and I won't dwell too much on this, except to say that for me the conceptual conundrum was, how does an African architect intervene in Inner Mongolia? And what is an appropriate form of language and response to context? Do I use this opportunity to further my career and do a signature sort of building which is typical of what I would do anywhere else, or do I listen to context? I took the latter approach, and I was particularly inspired by, or rather depressed, by the extent to which Beijing's development in the last 10 to 20 years, and in fact other parts of China, have really eroded the Chinese sensibility of urban form and architecture. They have a very particular, let's call it, hierarchy of public and private spaces. And I was intrigued by this notion of a semi-public space which happens within the Hutong sort of courtyard dynamic. So the building that I essentially did was an assemblage of three elements: line, solid, void, basically a series of cubes which interlock together to form a semi-public space within the heart of the building. And really the idea was to critique this notion of villa, being in the middle of Ordos and not really interacting with its context, but making a building in which the innards actually turn to the outside. And it was also highly informed by a lot of Mongolian mythology, and we called it the Palace of the North. I found a very interesting Mongolian poem which takes a whole month to recite, and I analyzed the poem and then abstracted it into the architectural form. And I think this project was also quite intriguing because it didn't fit the sort of expectations that I was asked by certain people in China about what type of building would I make, and the sort of hut sort of references seemed to emerge in these conversations. And I said, no, I'm not going to make a hut. Anyway, so this is a shot of that sort of sliver, let's call it that canyon between the two buildings, in which the public are drawn into the internal space. The next project is interesting for me because I was asked to do a public transport office building for government. The brief was for it to be the first sustainable building for the state. But what's interesting is the actual tenant. We have a phenomenon in South Africa of commuter taxis, which is a sort of semi-formal industry which is quite powerful, but also prone to violence and constantly clashing with government. And similar to the police station, the government had always taken the attitude that this commuter taxi industry people were animals and not worthy of being treated correctly, and it caused a lot of strife, pretty much going back to the 1980s. So I made the argument that we would, again, make a building in which a taxi driver would feel that they're actually given respect and being a part of the community. So the language of the building, as opposed to what was there before, was deliberately contemporary, large volumes, big spaces where if taxi people had a debate and they wanted to address their grievances, that the civic architecture that was presented would dignify how those grievances are conveyed, expressed, and resolved. And in short, it was, I mean, aside from the sort of normative, let's call it technical issues about making a sustainable building, natural ventilation, looking at the heat gain and heat loss and those sorts of mappings, this building was also specifically located in a very poor area. I don't know if you can see the context, because again, government wanted to make the message that they believe in people and they want to actually respond to the needs of the township. So its setting was quite important. The height was was a big issue. I mean, it's only 7 stories, but it's actually the tallest building in the area. And a lot of the debates and discussions that we were having with the client, being the premier of the state, was really about making a new type of architecture that could help transform this agenda of integrating the taxi community within broader society. So the materials and the structures, it's fairly simple. It's a series of boxes, sort of tectonic approach. But I think really for me the most important thing is just its role in terms of really responding to a sort of new interface for a sector of society that has always been on the periphery. Recently, I've been asked to do a museum for the Food and Allied Workers Union. It was founded by a woman named Ray Alexander Simons. She moved to South Africa as a teenager, I think just after World War I, and literally formed a trade union by the age of 14. And in fact, the Food and Allied Workers Union was quite instrumental in the 1980s in terms of mobilizing people on the ground because the ANC was banned. So this becomes quite an interesting and significant site of intervention because it's in Gugulethu. You might have heard in the news about a killing of a tourist that happened there a couple of weeks ago. So it's a fairly complicated site, and in fact, before 1994, an American activist, Amy Beale, was also killed not too far from the actual project. And for me, the conceptual proposition here was I interviewed quite a famous writer named Njabule Ndebele about township life. And he told me that growing up in the township, everything works spatially in sets of 3. So if you stayed in one house, the next 3 houses would be your community. And you would not walk beyond those 3 streets because you would overlap with another community and you'd get into fist fights and so on. But what he also said was that you would have 3 sets of 3. So whenever there was a political or social issue, communities would organize in 3 sets of 3 and so on and so forth. So this number 3 became quite an interesting, let's say, device, so to speak with. And when I investigated the type of spaces that we put in the building, this metaphor of almost a sort of scalar approach to reading this landscape became quite important. So essentially, I'll actually jump back to this image. We've got the museum component sitting over here, but in fact, this is the whole sort of site. There is a water feature over here, which is a detention pond where currently lots of children drown every winter, which is our rainy season. So the intervention largely was, okay, sorry, go back. The intervention was to create the museum, but also to rehabilitate this context, and you can begin to see the sort of fragmented language of the informal settlement. And in some ways, there's a sort of dialogue between the formality of the urban intervention along the side versus the informality and the sort of splicing of opportunities across the space. The structure of the building is essentially 3 rectangular spaces which interlock in volume. They are structured according to 3 in terms of height, width, and depth. The creation of a sculpture park at the bottom scale over here. This is the existing building where Ray Alexander Simons first held her initial rallies, and then a tower which forms a visual beacon in the landscape, which is actually how you access the whole museum complex by actually coming in from underground. The project at right now is really in its early stages. I mean, this is an organization which has never done a museum before, so a lot of the work is not necessarily the designing of the building, but understanding how to structure a museum, how to structure curatorial practices, what type of institutional vehicle is appropriate and structured, fundraising, and a lot of my work is very much in that sort of domain because I've realized that it is almost impossible to create architecture unless one is engaged in some sort of educational dynamic about what the site can offer. Currently, we've proposed to the city that this major street over here, which is one where I mentioned where Amy Beale was killed, that this would be pedestrianized, the creation of a park along the side, a sort of amphitheater which would face onto the building, and that effectively we would have a sort of urban renewal node. The project was launched by the deputy president, I think about 3 months ago, so I'm hoping that the fundraising will go well. But I haven't heard much from them at this particular point in time. And this is just very initial schematic renderings of the building, which essentially floats in the landscape and creates this alternate terrain beneath it. ADAMASTOR'S throne is a what I call a provocation. On occasion, I think it's quite important to do projects which are meant to stimulate a bit of debate. And one of the debates that we have in Cape Town is the issue of appropriate height of buildings. The argument behind this building was to create a sort of ecological tower which would do serious investigations in terms of wind, changing in wind patterns and the rising of the sea level. Adamastor, by the way, was a mythological Greek god who apparently lived at the top of Table Mountain and prevented Portuguese ships from rounding the Cape. That's when the Cape changed from being called the Cape of Storms to the Cape of Good Hope. Apparently, Adamastor was defeated when Bartholomew Diaz went around. So there's also a tongue-in-cheek play on the origins of Cape Town and this sort of notion of wind and colonization and development. This building is deliberately provocative in relation to its context, particularly because I think it's sometimes important to generate discussion and be not necessarily exemplary, but to take a sort of cutting-edge view in terms of what can architecture represent. And some interior shot on that side. Apologies for the DPI level there. The other project that I just want to, there's actually 3 more that I'm almost done. This project that I was asked to do was quite an interesting one. We are beginning to introduce bus rapid transit, or what we call integrated rapid transit in South Africa. And I was asked to put a proposal together for the capital city. And one of my key arguments is that the installation of infrastructure, whether it's a stadium or a police station, etc., can play a function that is more than just the engineering need of moving people from to and fro. So essentially the idea was plug and play, which is that all of these bus termini would play a very particular function depending on its context. So for example, if in one area you find that there isn't a clinic, then a clinic would be attached to the bus facility. If another area you found that there was a shortage of libraries or other sorts of social infrastructure, that would be attached to the bus facility. This requires that your your bus stops are actually on the side of the road as opposed to the median. And engineers prefer the median because it's cheaper, because you have one structure serving two sides. But my argument is that then it plays no urban function. So it might cost more to have two of the structures, but effectively it has a much more stronger impact. So one of the, and these are just quick examples of what these could be. I mean, this one was looking at adding an ATM with a sort of sculpture park where people could actually climb and do sort of mountain climbing sort of training on the area, charging of electrical vehicles in a bicycle rack, and saying that these can play different functions. The sleeve took on a very different notion where it was attached to a library and also attached to a potential sort of butterfly park, because one of these was located in quite a sensitive ecological area. So all that changes is essentially the scaffolding that wraps around the core structure, this being the basic module, and it being expressed in this sort of fashion or in that sort of way. I must mention that project, although it received a lot of acclaim from the client because of its urban function, they indicated that it's not their responsibility to solve urban issues, they just want to get people on buses. So for that reason, I did not succeed with the project. But I think it's quite telling that the level of, I would argue, ignorance about how to be strategic with investment and design and capital. Cape Town train station, I think, is particularly one of the projects where I think it speaks to this issue. The real challenge of Cape Town station, I would say, had a lot to do with its history. Stations and rail have had a very particular role to play in the evolution of South Africa, in the sense that rail was used as a colonial instrument to tame the landscape, in much the same way that the opening up of the Western United States has an intimate relationship with rail. It was the same thing in South Africa. So we have this quite a famous image of Cecil John Rhodes, who was quite a famous industrialist, with this image of connecting Cape Town to Cairo through rail, and from whom Zimbabwe was called Rhodesia. Now, for me, this is interesting because it shows the different roles that the station has played historically across time. In the 1960s, it was redesigned, and actually the president launched the building and said it's a shining example of apartheid and how we as a society need to live. And just to give you a sense of what that was, there was duplication of everything. There were double lifts, and there were lifts for white people, lifts for black people. There were trains for black people, so the whole infrastructure was duplicated. And what I thought would be quite interesting in terms of transforming the station with regards to 2010 and a post-1994 sensibility was to look at how do we make this place into something special. These are shots taken from the 1980s where protesters would run to the station, and in fact, when I was doing the design, I interviewed people and found that certain people were actually even tortured in the station. So although at a superficial level it's just a building, it has quite a charged history with locals, and its relationship to its context was quite problematic. So this is essentially what I inherited, a site in which you couldn't walk on the grass. There was limited entry into the building. It was all about control, very poor lighting, and very much treated as a sort of negative space, and it's right in the heart of the city. The crime levels on the station were quite high, but because people don't have access to cars, they had no choice but to go through this facility. So there were a number of challenges in terms of transforming the project. The first urban intervention was fairly mundane, so to speak. It's really about reclaiming the relationship between the city and the station by making a new sort of public space. You can see the value engineering that popped in there. So some of my detailings have changed quite drastically. But what's fascinating for me about this project is that these are shots of how the space is used now. And it's been totally transformed from a derelict spatial condition into one in which people gather and have spontaneous interactions. And that's what interests me about good architecture, when it creates the potential for new interactions to emerge. And when we had our World Cup event with the stadium in the background, there was a very interesting dialogue between the station and the stadium. And we had the only fan mile in the whole country where literally the whole city came alive, and there were parties happening along the route and particularly at the station. And this is a shot of an event that happened in that same space fairly recently. And I show this image because I think it's such a sharp contrast. Now it's become a place of gathering, a place of social interaction, a place of celebration, whereas before it was a place of oppression and a place of negativity. and the architectural intervention in terms of materiality is actually quite minimal. It's just a few key gestures about how do you define the space. Internally, I had a number of challenges looking at particularly the way that the space was structured. There was poor lighting, there were informal traders all over the space, so visual access was quite difficult. There was no signage or advertising strategy. The space was not compliant in terms of emergency evacuation. So I had to develop a design in which all of these sort of problems could be dealt with. And the solution was quite simple. Open the station up to the city, change the glazing, relocate the traders to a new sort of trading market, but essentially, again, have a relationship where as you come off from the trains, you can almost see the city as soon as you arrive. So again, that your sense of journey is that you don't get off into a train, into a dark space, and then back into the city, but you have a seamless transition. And I think this is probably one of the more successful spaces in the city. People actually come to the station to linger, whereas before that wasn't the case. People wanted to get out of the station as quickly as possible. They've had photo shoots inside there, they've had people gathering, hanging out, and it's without doing any major changes to the overall skeleton or envelope, the space has become far much more amenable to being part of city life. And for me, I mean, if you knew what this was like before, trust me, you'd be as excited as I am. And we were able to accommodate the event also, which is also one of my specific briefs, was to make sure that we meet all the sort of compliance conditions of 2010. Informal traders, I showed you that sort of strange trading unit. I designed a new one that would be used within the main concourse. It's essentially a sphere that closes up and down. This is partly to do with the closing of sight lines, but also that when these are shut, that they also remain like pearls within the concourse space, so that you don't leave it to chance the way in which informal trading begins to interact within the main concourse. And on the station deck itself, we had, as you can see, quite an informal setting. People who trade, and these are largely women, and one of the main problems is that they would trade, they would gather their income, but they had to walk quite a long distance to get to an ATM, so often people were mugged after work. People's goods were often stolen because it was just a trestle table, and also the rentals were quite high. So what I proposed, I worked with an advertising company, and we generated a model together where we demonstrated that through advertising, because of the foot traffic that you get to the station, we would be able to reduce the amount of capital that the individual trader would have to put into a trader unit. And we decided to make a sort of environment in which the traders would be able to trade with more dignity, with storage, security, signage, and actually transform quite a derelict space into a new sort of public realm. This also went through quite an extensive public participation process with about 300 different traders and numbers of presentations discussing and workshopping the design intentions with them. So these drawings are not the architect working in isolation, but there are processes that inform it. And then lastly, at what I call the XL, or the large scale, I've been asked to do a vision for Cape Town Station in the year 2030, and my main brief was to put in the first underground in Cape Town. So whereas I had a 2010 brief, I also had a 2030 brief. Now, one of the key debates that we were having was how do you model a city in the year 2030? And given the fact that most stations are refurbished on a 70-year cycle, essentially the design that I would put in now would need to be robust until the year 2100. So the issue of appropriate densities and particularly from a population perspective and the nature of the economy and all these sorts of things became quite critical, because a lot of the people in Cape Town were quite comfortable with current densities. But we had to demonstrate that the current densities are not only unsustainable from a let's call it an economic perspective, but you need to work with accurate forecasts to scale this project. So I developed the notion of the TOD, transit-oriented development, and applied it onto the site. I mean, it's TODs, obviously, it's international knowledge what that is. But this was also quite transformative, because for the first time they realized that rail infrastructure is an opportunity for housing, is an opportunity for urban densification. So whereas before rail was simply seen as movement, now it has a sort of different role. And through a series of mappings where I looked at historical urban spaces, looking at cycling routes and so on, I proposed a sort of new network which would effectively stitch the city together, because this piece of land, which is about 58 hectares, effectively divided the city in two, which caused all sorts of implications in terms of urban growth and urban development. And integrating it with transport infrastructure, sewage, utilities, etc., was all part of the brief. And I managed to, with the densities that I predicted, I managed to squeeze in about 45,000 extra people into the city. And what this means is, if you remember before, I spoke about the sort of eccentric nature of Cape Town, with people on the periphery and not in the core, is that this was an opportunity for people to have close living in proximity to where they actually work. So the project was not just an exercise in urban densification, but it also had a sort of polemic dimension in terms of bringing people previously displaced from the city back into the CBD. And this was just a speculative sketch I had done where I'd sunk in the train station underground with a transport museum above on the actual site. Very early schematic shot of what it could potentially be like in the underground. We went through all the processes of geotechnical issues, etc. And then these are the sort of massing diagrams where I was particularly looking at two phenomena. The one is the relationship of how wind would change in the year 2030 because of climate change. So that began to influence the form of the buildings. And the more sort of normative, let's call it urban planning friendly massing model. And there were the whole host of other permutations. And at that point, I would like to say
Connected Cape Town is an integrated mixed-use development that seamlessly connects public transport modes, serviced by the full range of low-carbon-intensive transport modes, with a particular emphasis on light, tram and electrical personal transport, tailored towards the needs of the pedestrian. Connected Cape Town is typified by its iconic and vibrant central spine, which not only plays host to a real 24-hour lifestyle, but is a major contributor to the biodiversity of the CBD, and offers a range of historically informed public spaces, offering a blend between culture and public space making. Boarding a train, we enter the Health and Wellness Precinct, Neighbourhood D, housing a fitness park, a public swimming pool, and squash and tennis courts. This precinct offers residents an opportunity to care for their bodies and well-being as easily as they would their economic well-being. Clinics and healthcare centres are complemented by open spaces, a research centre, as well as high-density housing. This creates individuals and communities at work and at leisure who are informed by a value system of mutual respect and human solidarity. Using the many forms of sustainable, pedestrian-friendly transport available on the site, one enters Neighbourhood C. Dedicated as a service precinct, Neighbourhood C offers government services and social services such as paying municipal bills and daycare and kindergarten respectively. Beautiful recreational spaces and government staff housing make Neighbourhood C a friendly, relaxing and efficient destination. As we move into Neighbourhood B, we enter a site of innovative technical research and education. The spirit of the entrepreneur thrives here, with restaurants, cafes, stores, a food market, and various forms of micro-industry. Complemented by a fire station and a resource centre, Neighbourhood B is an incubator of economic and technological advancement. Neighbourhood A, which lies at the heart of the CBD, houses a cultural centre, a museum, an art gallery, and a memorial park, in line with emphasising the heritage significance of the site. The neighbourhood is also home to the Department of Home Affairs, the South African Police Service, law courts, financial service institutions, as well as high-density urban housing. The seamless integration of the precincts, underpinned by various and diverse transport modes, serves as a connection between our past and our future. A connection between mountain and sea. A connection between rich and poor. A connection of ideas and dreams. It is a place for all, leading the way in an equitable Cape Town. A just Cape Town. A vibrant Cape Town. Welcome to Connected Cape Town.
Just one caveat. That commission was essentially an urban planning presentation. It wasn't an architectural project. So the architectural resolution is deliberately ambiguous. It was more about the sort of planning and infrastructure approaches to the site.
Do you have any questions?
Is that a good or a bad thing?
Yeah, I have a very specific question. When you were talking about the police station and when he said that they would break the faucets,
Yes.
how do you convince the client, or in this case the head of the police, who actually knows so much about his force, that no, this is a good thing and it will change? How does that conversation kind of take place, and how do you convince someone like that that no, this is not actually the best thing?
Well, you know, fortunately, the precedent is always a good device. I mean, Wheel Arrest did a very good police station. I think it was in the early 90s. And the argument that I made was basically a humanist and social one. You know, if we continue to be pessimistic and cynical about the human condition, then we will only replicate those type of behaviors. So I was making the argument that even the smallest thing, such as the type of faucet you put in a bathroom, a door handle, the color of a wall, can assist in transforming I stress the word assist in transforming how people behave in space. I was also fortunate in that the police themselves were very much interested in transforming their perception in society. You know, they stopped being a force, they became a service, they wanted to be seen as friendly, they had lots of commercials on TV, and I told them that, you know, you can have the marketing image of being a service, but you need to translate that into concrete actions about how do you behave yourselves, you know what I mean? And that goes right down to how you plan that building. Where do you put the superintendent's office? Where do you put the mess hall? Where do you put the smoking area? Where do you put the cells? All of those type of decisions can reinforce a new way of being for the police. And at the end of the day, it's also just being dogmatic and explaining your point through different arguments. You can't just be emotional. You need to have precedent. You need to have research, but you must also have conviction. Because if you're unsure of what you're trying to do, people will not pay you to do that. Yeah.
Over here. You mentioned you mentioned twice in 2 of your projects that external people from different parts of the world didn't think or thought of a certain African aesthetic. What would you say the sharpest difference between the internal African aesthetic is versus the worldview of it?
Look, first off, I think the notion of an African aesthetic is a contentious idea. Because Africa is far too large and far too complex. That's why I said in my paper that simplistic readings about what is an appropriate African aesthetic will fail. Because we have examples of modernity, we have examples of contemporary work, we have huts, we have the pyramids in Egypt. So I think it's more important to talk about the type of field of relationships that are set up by architecture as the form of the aesthetic. So my buildings are very much predicated on how they influence how people behave, whether it looks modernist or it looks curved. You know, for me, the aesthetic is the aesthetic of human interaction. Now, contrast that with like the trophy, for example, where I consciously made a form which did not look like a form which was African, but it could have come from any place. But I think the sort of, the way that I sculpted it, it was very different to the sort of rectilinear and structured and sort of precise geometries of a typical trophy. I've been asked in many forums about what is an appropriate architectural language and aesthetic, and what can that be. And I admit that, you know, my subjectivity, my training, my background perhaps colors my particular perception of what that is, but I'm far much more interested in architecture in which responds to contextual needs, and sometimes those needs are not form related, but they're culture related, they're institution related, they are socially related. And how can architecture play more than being an enclosure, but actually become a catalytic intervention point. And sometimes, like for example in the Cape Town Station forecourt, the architecture is almost absent, but it makes a space which is entirely different than what it was for the last 40 years.
This might be related to Chris's question in some way. There seems to be a tendency, I think, for at least what I've seen in some student projects, to glamorize the informal, maybe coming from the city. And here I see, to some extent, a desire to be maybe released from it or to change to something formal. And it struck me that there was, the question is, how do you maintain either that balance, and is the balance between the informal and formal even desired anymore, or is a time to move on?
It's a very good question, because it goes to the heart of lots of our urban and architectural discussions in Cape Town and the country in general. My father's sister, or cousin rather, has been an informal trader for 40 years. And she'd be at the sidewalk selling beetroots, and she's actually trapped in a very particular economic cycle. And I think it's very easy for us to take the liberal position and to romanticize the trader on the sidewalk who has ingenuity in terms of how they're navigating the city and surviving. The fact of the matter is that nobody really wants to survive, everybody wants to thrive. So what I did with particularly those spaces, that I did what's called an economic progression model, where I structured the sequence of spaces so that you could have an emerging trader, so to speak, who might get a 1-by-1 square meter place, but then they would then graduate to a 2-by-2, to a 4-by-4, and then you actually set conditional limits for how long somebody can occupy a particular space, so that you encourage the progression. I don't have an aversion to the formalization of informal context, as long as it's done with sensitivity. And I'm also not keen on gentrification in its brutal form. But I also have a lot of caution about romanticizing poverty and romanticizing the native and going through the township and saying this is so cool, and then freezing those people, I use those deliberately, in a form of suspended animation in which we glamorize the township. And I stand in a minority on that, because many people will talk about how sexy the township is and let's keep it as it is, but they would never stay there. So, yeah.
But I just wanted to ask you a question, and maybe that is related to Esteban's question about this relationship between the formal and the formal. What struck me about your projects is the degree to which they are all essentially interventions in the formation of a kind of, or remaking literally of a public sphere, of an introduction of a public sphere for an emerging nation, essentially. And you talked about South Africa as a developing nation, and the desire for a level of humanity within that. But I was wondering, like, how in your projects do you negotiate that pressure of maybe private development and privatization and neoliberalism within a country that clearly is very industrialized and is a global banking concern, and so what is that balance between let's say that informal economy and the formal economy that exists, that's already in some respects globalized?
Sure. I mean, I don't have many private clients. Let me first say that up front. My people know me as working in sort of social space. But I make an argument that just because I'm working in the social space, it doesn't mean the architecture doesn't have to be sophisticated and advanced. I also write in the Cape Times about this sort of issue about how to mediate the forces of commerce, which can be quite brutal in South Africa. I mean, we have really wealthy people and places of incredible excess, and it's very easy to lose one's ethics and participate in that world and ignore the huge swathe that is around oneself. I wouldn't say that I have found a balance in my practice as yet. A lot of my work, some of them are hit or miss. I think they're experiments, they're ideas which are incomplete, and I look back on and they haven't worked. But I think as much as clients choose you, I think the architect also has the right to think how they choose their clients and the type of work that they do. And I think that would reduce a lot of the conflict. On Cape Town Station in particular, it was a very difficult project because, at first we started with a sort of social intervention. It was a government project and they were very keen on all the ideas. And then the minister made this statement about all of the train infrastructure having to pay for themselves. So overnight, the social dynamic suddenly switched to a very commercial dynamic. In fact, this presentation, you'll notice that I deliberately dropped in words about culture. I never spoke about the offices that need to be there, because I was trying to provoke the client into understanding their cultural, social responsibility. Can balance ever be found? I don't know. I mean, you'll come to South Africa at some point. The differences are so stark that sometimes the only way to try and find balance is to swing at the opposite end, and do your damnedest to be as much as a counterpoint to the current prevailing condition.
You mentioned here and also with the students that South Africa is a very sort of young country, and we're working in Johannesburg, and you also sort of talked about the city trying to come to terms with what it should be in terms of going forward. And so, for example, at the recent World Expo, I think the theme was Better City, Better Life. And perhaps it's the image of modernity in contrast perhaps with your sort of thesis about relationships. So how do you think that you negotiate the condition between what the image of the city should be, and I'm thinking about the tower that you showed, with your thesis about aesthetics and actually being concerned more about the aesthetics of relationships rather than the aesthetics of the image?
Sure. I mean, talking about the World Expo, because I actually delivered a lecture there, and I was actually quite struck because I think there was a discord between the theming of the event and the content that was showed there. It's quite a difficult one, because I do believe that one can talk about aesthetics and ethics in a sort of interchangeable sort of way. I mean, if you think of Wittgenstein and so on, that the way that you make your buildings and how they look represents tacitly your values and what they are. But I think in a lot of my projects, some of them, quite frankly, are tongue-in-cheek, because it's very much about that pendulum and just providing a counterpoint. When the buildings are actually manifest, for example, the police station and the community center and so on, I mentioned this notion about a bold humility and a sort of selfless disregard. Those projects are very different to the unbuilt projects, which are almost experiments, as it were, and ways of just trying to push the boundaries. This notion of balance is something that, if I can just expand, I mean, I'm intrigued. We're taught to think of balance, and we're taught to think of this and the architecture finding a middle road. But the more and more that I've interacted with architecture, I think balance is almost impossible. The forces of one particular client and context always conspire to make a project skewed in one direction or the other. And I think balance should be perceived more, how does this relate into something else? So, for example, the tower is not so much about its aesthetic form on its own, but the tower in dialogue with the mountain and the city in between, and that type of sort of tension, because seen on its own, I'm not really convinced that it would be that particularly effective. In terms of the studio approach and about young people and trying to find an appropriate aesthetic, I've taken a very personal position about what I call the aesthetic of human relationships. I think the role of the agent or the author in terms of being authentic to oneself about what is one's position is probably more important to me than the actual outcome. We have a youth in South Africa that have been demoralized, have no sense of self-confidence, who are always trying to find easy answers and trying to be something else than what they are in order to be. And I look at my work as an example to say to people, you can be whatever you want to be, and just put it out there and let the world absorb it and reflect. So what I would say to our students, particularly this issue of Johannesburg and so on, and how to intervene in a very foreign context, I think it's critical to read the context as best as one possibly can, but to bring one's subjectivity to the table and let it be confronted by difference and so on. I don't know if that partly answers what you're saying. Yeah.
I have a question about the last project.
The 2031.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because that's an incredible new density for Cape Town.
Yes, it is.
So, yeah. I know over here it looks, looks very, very low
normative.
normative,
It's quite radical.
Yeah. So I'm curious about the response to that, and also in relation to something I should know more about. I kind of lost track of what happened with the right to a house, once South Africa changed. And I know that has been sort of hugely controversial, especially since all those houses were sort of little houses. And
For sure.
Right. And so the polemics of your new project in relation to what's happened with the right to housing and whether that's succeeded or failed in any way.
The 2030 project is very controversial for those very reasons, because you see a lot of the urban planning paradigm is about 3-story dwellings and so on, but if you actually map the potential density of the CBD according to that versus a strong and vibrant economy, we should be looking at buildings that average 7 to 10 stories, et cetera, et cetera. So what we have is this sort of conundrum where people like the way Cape Town looks now, but they don't understand the economic implications of freezing development in its current form. You'll also see that on the diagram, the buildings are far much closer than average, because the research that we've shown is that with climate change coming in, wind and the sun is going to get far much stronger. So we're going to have a climate which requires buildings that are much closer together in the future than they are currently now. And that also was a point of contention, because everybody wanted the wide sort of rolling Ramblas boulevards. And I said, listen, look at the climate. And again, responding to context. On the issue of housing, last year I was appointed, the only architect, I've been appointed the advisor to the National Minister of Housing. And we've had long discussions about this issue of the right to housing versus the right to houses. And the proposal that I put to him is that he needs to, at some point, either in 2012 or in 2014, because the ANC has to make a decision on this, they need to actually start engaging the public in explaining that there simply isn't enough fiscus or capital to maintain this culture of everybody getting a house, and that a new type of urbanism needs to evolve. And I've argued that the government should be involved in making what I call incubator housing opportunities. Again, create rental stock. You can stay in it for 4 to 5 years, and then you should be encouraged to move on so that young people can come in. And that's quite a big political debate because of the promise of 1994, everybody gets a house and this. But the reality is that, again, the numbers are not pointing to the current status quo as being sustainable. Yeah. But you're absolutely correct. The first project has been quite interestingly controversial for a number of reasons. Yeah. That program still continues. But what's interesting is I'm doing some research, and I'm increasingly getting data where young people are saying because they want to pursue jobs, they need to be mobile. And if you're given a house, that actually restricts the ability for you to move. So if you want an innovative country to develop, you should make your country or city as flexible as possible for people between the ages of 18 and 33, and not try to tie them down to a fixed asset, Whereas before the notion was everybody wants a house and so on, and you find that the jobs are elsewhere. And I think that in the worldview and the logic of government, which is a different generation, they don't understand the fluidity of how innovative and knowledge-oriented markets work, and the need to be able to move, to go to different cities and not be tied down with an asset.
Thanks, everybody.
Okay.
For me, from the kinds of questions, it was a very nice audience.
Thank you. Thank you. I apologize if it was a bit long. I didn't. Was I over? No, it's good. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.